10 years ago, I found myself alone in the woods near a mountain stream, cold, wet, hungry, covered in mosquitoes, fantasizing about Oreo cookies and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Show of hands, how many here have been on Levita? So you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're in the wilderness in the Adirondack Mountains, building character with your friends. And there's this part called the solo, where you go off by yourself for 48 hours. Not much more than a bottle of water, a Bible, and a sleeping bag. Well, it didn't go very well for me. My guide showed me how to build a shelter by tying a plastic sheet to several trees, but I did such a terrible job that the sheet made a sort of canal for the rain, so it flowed right down onto the end of my sleeping bag. Can you fail, Levita? I'm sure I was close. Late one miserable afternoon, I climbed a hill and found a flat rock with a view of the sky. And I waited for the still, small voice of God. What I really wanted was some glorious, unmistakable sign. I was 20 years old, and I didn't know what to do with my life. I wanted what Gideon had. Does anybody remember Gideon? When I was 6 years old, he was my favorite Bible character. He used to have this book called the Picture Bible, the whole Bible in comic book form. I had Gideon's story memorized. Israelites being tormented by a cruel band of desert tribesmen called the Midianites, hiding in caves, secretly threshing their grain. Gideon's doing this one day when a stranger comes up and tells him, "You've been chosen to save your people." Well, Gideon is skeptical of this. He doesn't know who this guy is. Basically, he says, "Prove it." And so the stranger, who happens to be an angel, makes fire come out of his staff. And this is very impressive, but Gideon still wants more. He asks God to give him 2 more unmistakable signs that he really has been chosen. And God does. Gideon knows it's time to act. So then we get to the really good part. I had this whole thing memorized. Imagine this passage read in the high-pitched voice of a 6-year-old boy. At Gideon's signal, the men blow their trumpets, smash their pitchers, wave their torches, give the battle cry, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon," and charge down the hill, 300 against thousands. I was kind of a weird kid. Actually, I was one of 6 kids. My dad was a preacher. My mom homeschooled all of us. There was this word they used to use all the time, worldly, of the world. It was something we were supposed to avoid. To this day, I'll be in a group of people my age, and they'll start reminiscing about things like the Smurfs, or the Goonies, or New Kids on the Block, and I'll start to get strangely quiet. If anybody asks why, I'll just say something like, "Well, I wasn't really around for the 80s. We didn't have a TV. Rock and roll wasn't allowed. We would listen to the radio sometimes, but it would be usually Christian radio. Programs like the Children's Bible Hour. I don't know if anyone here ever heard that. Stories were very dramatic. I'll never forget this episode where these 2 boys are at a lake. There's a sign that says, "No swimming." And of course, Billy has to go in anyway. These kids, they were always named Billy. I don't know why. unfortunately, it wasn't a funny story. So his friend Jimmy goes in to save him. And his heart gives out and he dies because he has heart trouble. Jimmy dies while saving Billy. And the lesson is clear. This is what Jesus did for us. He was blameless and we were sinners. And he died to save us from our sin. There were other stories like that. My dad had a bunch of cassette tapes from a musician named Michael Card, great songwriter. He recorded a song that still gets me every time I hear it. It's called Why. Why did it have to be a heavy cross he was made to bear? And why did they... Pardon me. And why did they nail his feet and hands? His love would have held him there. It was a cross, for on a cross, a thief was supposed to pay. And Jesus had come into the world to steal every heart away. So that story was all around me as I grew up, in music, drama, books, plus church every Friday night and Sunday morning. But in our homeschool class, we mostly read books. We'd go to the library and we'd check out as many as 50 at a time. I think I was 11 by the time I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. And by then I was old enough to know who Aslan the lion represented and why he laid down willingly on the stone table as the evil white witch stood over him with her knife. 9 years later, on that flat rock above the stream, I waited for my sign from God. The sun was setting. These lovely sherbet orange clouds were floating across the horizon. And I noticed this cloud with an unusual shape. I had studied the world map a lot during my sequestered childhood, and this cloud looked exactly like Spain. Now, I had no idea what to make of this. Was I supposed to drop everything, fly to Spain on borrowed money, and await further instructions? I didn't even speak Spanish. In fact, I had ruined my GPA here at Gordon in Spanish 101. What would Gideon have done? He would have said, "Prove it," right? He would have asked for more signs. Well, I didn't get any more signs. To this day, I don't know if that Spain-shaped cloud was a sign from God or some delirious hallucination. I still had to live my life. I'd taken some journalism classes here at Gordon with a great professor, Steve Crow, who showed me over and over again with his red pen that my writing was less brilliant than I had previously believed. I liked the idea of journalism, but sometimes I thought newspaper stories could be a little dry. And one day after class, Professor Crow casually mentioned the term narrative journalism. I felt a tingle of excitement. As I found out, in narrative journalism, you find an amazing story. You do a lot of hard work proving it's actually true, and then you tell it from beginning to middle to end. For a kid who'd spent his whole life immersed in amazing stories, this sounded like the perfect job. Well, not so fast. See, when you're a Christian, you take a lot of things on faith, right? That's the whole point. You believe in a God you've never seen. You picture him working in mysterious ways beyond human understanding. In journalism, it's exactly the opposite. You take nothing on faith. You believe nothing unless it can be verified, documented, proven through the human senses. There's an old saying in the business, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Make a few phone calls, ask around a little. Well, as I soon found out, it's hard enough to find any kind of full-time job in journalism, and it's really hard to find a job that lets you write long narrative pieces all day, every day. Hardly anyone fresh out of college has the skill to do it well. You have to start small and keep practicing. So that's what I did. Moved back in with my parents, took a job at a twice-weekly paper in a small town, took pictures of car wrecks, dropped off the film at Winn-Dixie, picked it up in about an hour, covered murder trials, helicopter crashes, the board of directors for the local hospital. Very glamorous. I learned what they call the discipline of verification, double-checking everything, finding all kinds of obscure public records that would help me piece the story together. After a year, I moved back to the North Shore to work as a freelancer for the Salem News at $40 a story. I'm not a very disciplined writer, but you'd be amazed at what you can do when you're living alone on Rantoul Street in Beverly and the rent is coming due. One week I turned in 17 stories. Now, I'm not saying they were good stories, but they were enough to pay the rent anyway. I was always trying to get people in trouble, you know. Hamilton Wenham School Committee holds illegal secret meeting. Or Danvers Police Department illegally destroying documents. The freelance job became a staff job. And the stories I wrote there helped me get to a bigger paper down in Florida, and then a bigger one, the St. Petersburg Times, where narrative journalism is a way of life. I spent 7 years in newspapers before I caught my big break. I'd written a fan letter to Gary Smith from Sports Illustrated. Gary's been called the best magazine writer in America. And much to my surprise, Gary Smith actually wrote me back. Sometimes the best at what they do are also the nicest. Maybe it's not a coincidence. I sent him a story I'd done, and he liked it so much that he got on the phone. He lives in South Carolina, but he got on the phone to the big boss in New York and asked him to give me a chance. And they gave me a chance, a freelance assignment about a high school basketball game from a long time ago where one team was down to 2 players because everybody else had fouled out of the game. 2 against 5. And those 2 guys came back against 5 and they won the game. Yeah, it's true. And that wasn't even the half of it. Well, you can read it later if you want to. When I was struggling and I couldn't finish writing this story, Gary Smith helped me put it together. This is the best magazine writer in America, giving up his time for a total stranger, staying on the phone with me for 6 hours, 6 hours, helping me fix everything that was wrong. That story, 2 on 5, won an award for Best Story of 2008 for all of Time Incorporated, all because Gary Smith went out of his way to help me. Well, meanwhile, something terrible happened. Michael Hollander, a kid I'd grown up with, had become an army medic and gotten killed when he stepped on a bomb in Iraq. And that news was very hard to hear. I'd thought about joining the army myself, but I didn't do it. I felt somehow as if Michael had died in my place. At his funeral, people seemed to think that he had been heroically running to help other soldiers just before he was killed. But the whole story, it was mysterious. People didn't seem to know what had really happened. And I felt somehow as if I had to know. I had to find out. I had to prove it. I mentioned this idea to the editor at Atlanta Magazine, near Michael's hometown. She told me if I came to work there, I could get started on that story right away. And so that's what I did. I flew to Texas, California, and Alaska, interviewing Michael's fellow soldiers and longtime friends, trying to piece it all together. And I found out it was all true. The eyewitnesses confirmed it. He was never a good runner. And it got even worse when he hurt himself jumping out of an airplane. But running was the last thing he did on earth. He'd heard over the radio that a soldier was wounded out by the Euphrates River. And he took off running with 100 pounds of gear on his back, through 100-degree heat, past the enemy machine guns, up a dirt road he knew was full of bombs. They called him Doc Hollander. Doc Hollander knew exactly what he was doing. He laid down his life for his friends. Well, as I worked on that story, I was still freelancing for Sports Illustrated. And I asked the editors if I could write about women's college softball. They weren't sure the readers would go for a big, long story about women's college softball. What did that have to do with LeBron James, you know? But they let me go after it because this particular story had such a strange and unusual power. This player, Sarah Tucholsky, hits a home run one day, the first of her whole career. And she's so excited, she forgets to step on first base. So her coach is yelling, Sarah, come back and touch first base. She turns to come back, but she turns so quickly that she tears her ACL, this ligament in her knee, and she falls down. There's a big commotion. The umpire doesn't know what to do. Will the run count? He says no, because she didn't touch all the bases. He's arguing with the coach. And all this time, Sarah's lying in the dirt in terrible pain. And her teammates can't help her because then she'd be out. Well, there's a girl playing first base for the other team, Mallory Holtman. Mallory doesn't want to see this girl suffer. So she says to the umpire, what if we carry her? And the umpire can't think of a rule against it. So Mallory calls the shortstop over, and they pick up this girl from the other team, and they carry her around the bases, stopping to let her touch each base, helping her score a run against them. Even though if they lose this game, they'll be out of the playoffs. And Mallory's team does lose, her last chance in college to make the playoffs. But she knows it's the right thing to do. Well, that story helped me get a full-time staff job with SI. And I'd heard about this kid in Kentucky who collapsed and died from heat stroke one day during football practice, high school kid. There had been a huge police investigation, more than 100 witness statements. They put the coach on criminal trial because they said it was his fault the kid died. So I went and talked to everyone I could, and must have read about 5,000 pages of these police and court documents, trying to put it all together. I found out a lot about this kid, Max Gilpin. He wasn't a great football player, but he was obedient. His teammates were goofing off that afternoon, so the coach decided to punish the whole team, including Max. And this punishment fell very hard on Max because he was a big kid who couldn't run well. But Max was obedient. He wanted to please the coach and his father. And he ran those sprints as hard as he could, even though he was probably sick that day. Temperature 103, 104, 105, up to 107, and maybe even higher, to the point where his cells were literally melting. This kid was obedient to the end. He took the punishment that was earned by his teammates. Ran harder than most of them. And in dying, he taught coaches across America about the dangers of heat stroke. In other words, with his death, Max Gilpin almost certainly saved other young athletes who otherwise probably would have died themselves. My next story took a long time to make any sense. I wanted to write about this guy, Darrent Williams, a Denver Broncos player who was shot to death almost 5 years ago after a New Year's Eve party at a nightclub. On the surface, you could have looked at it and said, well, he just put himself in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. He showed up at the club in this long white limousine wearing a $50,000 diamond-studded gold chain, surrounded by these hip-hop artists who called themselves the $1 Billion Scholars. And there were gang members in that club. They were jealous about these Denver Broncos rolling in and stealing all the attention. At midnight, somebody popped a bottle of champagne, sprayed everywhere, and it got all over the clothes of this gangster they called Little Willie. Little Willie was furious about that. And eventually he ran to go get his gun. But there was more to the story. These rappers, the $1 Billion Scholars, had been there and seen everything. Their account of that night's events had been basically ignored by the news media. Well, I persuaded their manager to let me come out to Texas and talk to them. He said, meet us at the recording studio, which turned out to be a kind of glorified shed behind somebody's house where a pit bull was being kept in a cage. And these rappers told me some astonishing things. I sat there for 5 hours listening. And by the time it was over, I said, I have to know if their story is true. I have to prove it, if it is. So I flew to Denver, where the prosecutor had all the case materials, literally a dozen file boxes full of documents and video footage. It took several days to go through it all. I started to form a theory about what had happened, and I checked with the prosecutor and the detective just to make sure, and they both confirmed it. Yeah, it's true Darrent Williams was flashing a $50,000 diamond chain that night. True that people were jealous. True that he wasn't a hero or a saint. But after the club had shut down for the night, Darrent Williams and his friends got in the limousine peacefully. They had a chance to get home safely. And Darrent Williams saw something that made him take off that chain and get out of the limo. Out by the snowbank, his Broncos teammate, Brandon Marshall, was caught up in a fight with Little Willie, this angry local gangster. Darrent Williams could have driven home right then, made it home safe. But he got out of the limo, and he ran to help his friend to break up the fight. He told Marshall, "Get in the limo." And that's the most likely reason that Little Willie fired into Darrent Williams' limo a few minutes later. He was trying to kill the other Bronco. Darrent Williams went back for his teammate to save him from the gangster. And that decision cost him his life. A few months ago, I started thinking about these stories that I'd been chasing. And I realized what they had in common. They were real-life echoes of the story of Jesus Christ. You know, I might have missed a sign from God. Might not have gone to church or read the Bible as much as I should have. But this story was all around me, everywhere I looked. I couldn't get away if I tried. And it didn't even have to be about violence or death. It could be something smaller, more subtle. Like the softball player who carried her opponent around the bases. Or like my dad, who had a vintage Martin guitar that he sold to put food on our table. Or like my mom, who had the talent to become a famous artist or writer. But instead gave her time and energy to her 6 children for 37 years. From the time the first one was born until the last one was out of the house. Or like my wife, Sarah, put aside her own career, followed me up and down the East Coast so I could chase my dream. Or like Gary Smith, the best magazine writer in America, who put his reputation on the line for me. An unproven stranger. And then spent 6 hours on the phone helping me fix everything that was wrong. We're all like Gideon sometimes, aren't we? Maybe you've had a moment when you needed a sign. Maybe you got it, or maybe not. Next time you're waiting, maybe you can ask yourself this: do I know someone who needs a sign even more than I do? How can I be their sign? How can I prove to them that God's love is real? The story of Jesus is often called the greatest story ever told. Well, here's one of the greatest parts about it. It's not over. It's still being written. I've been out there in the world for the past 10 years, and I've seen it. There are millions of co-authors. They work on it every day. You were born to write your own chapter.